The sun bled crimson onto the parched earth, painting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers. Caleb swayed, the letter clutched in his fist, a flimsy shield against the memories clawing at him. Dust devils danced across the barren fields, mocking his return. The ranch house, or what was left of it, sagged like a broken-down mare. The porch railing splintered and useless. Years. Too many years. He pushed open the warped front door, the hinges screaming a protest that echoed the ache in his own chest. The air inside was thick with dust, and the scent of something wild, untamed. And then he saw her, perched on what remained of a once fine armchair, a young woman, no older than 20, with eyes the color of storm clouds. A shotgun lay across her lap, its cold steel reflecting the dying light. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink, just stared at him, a challenge in her gaze that could curdle milk. "This is my place now," she said, her voice rough, like gravel grinding against stone. Caleb swallowed, the words catching in his throat. My father, dead. Found him a month back, buried him out by the creek, marked the spot with a stone. She nodded towards the window, where the faint outline of a crude headstone could just be made out against the gathering dusk. He stared at her, the news a punch to the gut. He hadn't even known. The letter, forwarded through a chain of reluctant acquaintance, had been weeks old when it finally reached him. Now this wildcat claimed his inheritance. He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, the solace stretching between them, thick and heavy. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. Namesky Caleb. Sorry. She offered nothing else. He looked around the dilapidated room, picturing his mother's hand on the now rotting curtains, his father's laughter echoing in the empty space. It was all gone, swallowed by time and neglect. "Squatters' rights, you say?" he finally asked, his voice raspy. Sarah shifted, her grip tightening on the shotgun. "Got nowhere else to go. This land, it ain't being used." He saw the desperation in her eyes, the raw, untamed fear that mirrored his own. He'd seen that look before, staring back at him from a cracked mirror in a forgotten town. The West made orphans of everyone, one way or another. He walked past her, towards the fireplace, the stones blackened with soot. He knelt, running a calloused finger over a small, intricately carved wooden bird, half hidden beneath a pile of rubble. His mother had made it for him when he was just a boy. He didn't look back at Sarah. He didn't need to. He already knew what he was going to do. Caleb rose, the wooden bird cradled in his palm. Its smooth surface was a stark contrast to the roughness of his hands, a ghost of a gentler time. He turned, the silence amplifying the creak of his leather boots on the rotting floorboards. "I ain't here to cause trouble, Sarah," he said, his voice low, careful. "Just didn't know about my father, about any of this." He gestured around the dilapidated room, encompassing the broken furniture, the dust-choked air, the sheer desolation of the place. "Name your price. I'll pay you to leave." Sarah's eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening her features. "Money ain't what I need." He studied her, trying to decipher the meaning behind her words. She was young, but there was a weariness in her gaze that belied her age, a hardness that suggested she'd seen things no woman should. Then what is it you need? She didn't answer immediately, her gaze flicking towards the window, then back to him. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and heavy. Sweat trickled down Caleb's temples, plastering his hair to his forehead. This land, it ain't just dirt and rocks to me, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. It's a promise. A promise? Caleb frowned, confused. What kind of promise? Sarah stood abruptly, the shotgun rising with her. The movement was fluid, practiced. That's my business. Just know I ain't leaving. Not for you. Not for anyone. The air crackled with tension. Caleb held his ground, his hand instinctively drifting towards the worn leather of his gun belt. He hadn't wanted this. He'd hoped to come back, find some semblance of peace, maybe even rebuild what was lost. But this wild, defiant woman was standing in his way. You're making a mistake, Sarah, he said, his voice tight. This ain't worth fighting over. Not like this. Maybe not to you, she retorted, her grip tightening on the shotgun. But I ain't got nothing else, and I ain't about to let you take it from me. He saw the desperation in her eyes again, the fear that drove her. He knew that fear. He'd lived with it for years, a constant companion. But he also knew that fear could make a person do things they'd later regret. All right, he said, slowly raising his hands, palms open. All right. We don't have to do this. Let's just talk. Tell me what this promise is. Maybe we can find a way to work this out. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking between his face and his hands. The sun beat down relentless, turning the small room into a furnace. The only sound was the buzzing of flies and the ragged breathing of two strangers locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, she lowered the shotgun slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on him, wary and untrusting. The standoff wasn't over, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, there was a sliver of hope, a chance to bridge the gap between them. A chance to understand the hard bargain that had brought them both to this hard country. The shotgun dipped, but didn't fall. Sarah's eyes, though steel sharp, held a flicker of something else, exhaustion maybe. Caleb kept his hands raised, a gesture of truce under a sky that offered none. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind whispering through the gaps in the decaying walls. Talk, she finally rasped, the word hanging heavy in the stagnant air. Then talk. Caleb lowered his hands slowly, deliberately. He stepped back, putting more space between them. This place, it needs work. Roof's about to cave in. Wells probably dry. Winter's coming. He let the statement hang, a practical observation, not a threat. Sarah watched him, suspicion etched on her face. So, Caleb echoed. Either we both freeze or we fix it. He gestured towards the dilapidated structure. I know how to rebuild. My pa taught me. But I can't do it alone. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of options. She needed this place, that much was clear. And she knew as well as he did that a lone woman couldn't survive the winter in a broken-down shack. What's the catch? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. No catch, Caleb lied smoothly. Just a roof over our heads. For now, he wouldn't speak of legacies or promises, not yet. He just needed to start somewhere. The next morning, the sun rose on a scene of grudging cooperation. Caleb, his movements stiff from years of disuse, began patching the holes in the roof, his hammer blows echoing across the desolate landscape. Quarry, rifle slung across her back, cleared debris from the yard, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon. They worked in silence, a wary truce holding them together. As the days bled into weeks, a rhythm developed. Caleb, driven by a need to reclaim his past, hammered and sawed, slowly bringing the ranch house back to life. Sarah, her initial hostility softening, found herself helping him, her calloused hands surprisingly adept at carpentry. The shared labor eased the tension between them, revealing glimpses of their individual burdens. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caleb found Sarah sitting by the creek, staring into the water. He approached cautiously, the wooden bird, his mother's bird, tucked softly in his pocket. "Lost something?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah didn't turn, just remembering. He sat down beside her, the silence comfortable this time, not hostile. He noticed the lines etched around her eyes, the weariness that seemed to cling to her like dust. "My mother," he said, surprising himself with the confession. "She died young. Fever took her. This place, it was her dream." He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket, offering it to her. "She made this for me." Sarah took the bird, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. "It's beautiful." "She was," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "Strong too." "Like you," Sarah finally turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," Caleb conceded, "but I see the way you work. The way you fight reminds me of her." He saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a brief glimpse behind the hardened facade. He didn't push. He knew some wounds took time to heal. Some ghosts never truly faded. "This promise you spoke of," he said gently. "What is it?" Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated." She looked back at the water, her gaze lost in the swirling currents. The West had a way of complicating things, of twisting dreams into nightmares, of burying hope beneath layers of dust and despair. But as Caleb watched her, he saw a spark of resilience, a refusal to be broken. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that whatever that promise was, he was going to help her keep it. The creek gurgled a mournful tune, mirroring the secrets it held. Sarah remained silent for a long moment, the carved bird a tiny anchor in her calloused hand. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and rough. "My pa. He wasn't a good man. Drank too much, gambled away everything we had. But he always swore this land was different, said it held something special, something worth fighting for." Caleb waited, sensing the unspoken weight of her words. "He died. Sudden. Accident, they called it. But I know better. He owed some men money. Bad men." Her jaw tightened. "They wanted this land. He wouldn't give it to them." "And you think they'll be back?" Caleb asked, his hand instinctively moving towards his gun. Sarah nodded, her eyes hard. "I know they will. This ain't over." The sun dipped further, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The air grew cold, carrying the scent of pine and impending winter. Caleb felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. He'd come here seeking peace, a way to reconnect with his past. Instead, he'd stumbled into a brewing storm. The next day, a cloud of dust heralded the arrival of Jedediah, a burly rancher, with a face as weathered as the canyons he roamed. He rode a massive black stallion, his eyes scanning the dilapidated ranch with open disdain. He boomed, his voice carrying across the yard like thunder. "Heard you were back. Figured I'd pay my respects." He didn't dismount, holding himself high on the horse. Caleb met his gaze, his own face impassive. "Jedediah, haven't seen you in years." "Too long," Jedediah agreed, his eyes flicking to Sarah, who stood by the porch, her shotgun leaning against the railing. "And who's this?" "Name's Sarah," she said, her voice flat. Jedediah chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "A stray, I reckon." Caleb always did have a soft spot for strays. He turned back to Caleb, his eyes narrowing. "Heard she's been causing trouble, claiming ownership of land that ain't hers. She's got as much right to be here as anyone to one," Caleb said, his voice low and even. Jedediah raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "You defending her now, Caleb? Don't know much about her, do you? Here she's got a past, a real checkered one." "Everyone's got a past, Jedediah," Caleb retorted. "Yours ain't exactly spotless." Jedediah's smile vanished. "Just warning you, Caleb. She's trouble. Mark my words, this land ain't worth dying for." He paused, his gaze lingering on the surrounding fields, especially when it rightfully belongs to others. Caleb knew what Jedediah was implying. The man had been eyeing this land for years, wanting to expand his own already vast ranch. Sarah's presence was an obstacle, and Jedediah clearly intended to remove it, one way or another. "Appreciate the concern, Jedediah," Caleb said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But we can handle ourselves." Jedediah snorted. "We'll see about that." He reined his horse around, the stallion pawing the ground impatiently. "Just remember, Caleb, you choose your company carefully. Some folks ain't worth the trouble they bring." He spurred his horse, galloping away in a cloud of dust, leaving Caleb and Sarah standing in the gathering dusk. The wind picked up, carrying Jedediah's words like poison on the breeze. Caleb turned to Sarah, his face etched with concern. He didn't know what secrets she held, what darkness lurked in her past. But he knew, with a growing certainty, that Jedediah wasn't just concerned about some perceived wrong. He wanted this land, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. And Sarah, whether she knew it or not, was standing in his way. The dust settled, leaving a silence thicker than before Jedediah's visit. Caleb watched Sarah, her face unreadable. He knew Jedediah's words had struck home, planting seeds of doubt and fear. "He'll be back," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Caleb replied, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "We need to be ready." Days turned into a tense routine. They fortified the ranch house, reinforcing the doors and windows. Caleb sharpened his shooting skills, practicing with his rifle until his shoulder ached. Sarah patrolled the perimeter, her shotgun always at the ready, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape. Then, the well ran dry. The scrape of the bucket against the parched bottom sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. He hauled it up, empty and coated in dust. The water level had been dropping steadily for weeks, a slow, agonizing decline. Now it was gone. He found Sarah by the creek, her face grim. "Well's dry," he said, stating the obvious. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the trickle of water that barely flowed. "We're running out here, too. Summer's been hard. Without water, they wouldn't last long. The livestock would die, the crops would wither, and they themselves would succumb to the relentless heat. They needed to find another source, and fast." "There's a spring," Caleb said, breaking the silence, "up in the hills. It's a long ride, but it's our only chance." Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "How far?" "2 days, maybe 3, Caleb replied. "Depends on the horses. And on who we meet along the way." He knew Jedediah wouldn't let them leave unmolested. They packed what little supplies they had, dried meat, beans, and a few precious canteens of water. Caleb checked his rifle, making sure it was clean and loaded. Sarah saddled her horse, her movements quick and efficient. As they rode out of the ranch yard, the sun beat down on them, relentless and unforgiving. The landscape stretched before them, a vast expanse of dry, cracked earth and scrub brush. The air shimmered with heat, blurring the horizon. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves on the parched ground. Caleb kept a watchful eye on the surrounding hills, his senses on high alert. He knew Jedediah's men could be lurking anywhere, waiting for the opportunity to strike. Late in the afternoon, they came across a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a mesquite tree. Sarah drew her shotgun, but Caleb stopped her. "Let it be," he said. "It's just trying to survive, same as us." He guided his horse around the snake, giving it a wide berth. They had enough to worry about, without picking a fight with a creature just trying to stay alive. As the sun began to set, they found a small clearing near a dry creek bed. They made camp, building a small fire to cook their meager meal. The silence of the desert pressed in on them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. After they ate, Caleb took the first watch, his rifle resting across his lap. He stared into the flames, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't let Sarah face this alone. He didn't know why, not exactly. Maybe it was the memory of his mother. Maybe it was the spark of defiance he saw in Sarah's eyes. Whatever it was, he was in this now, and he wouldn't back down. Not for Jedediah, not for anyone. The West demanded a price, and he was ready to pay it. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the star-dusted skeethite. Caleb stirred the embers with a stick, the silence between them thick with unspoken anxieties. The horses shifted restlessly nearby, their breath puffing white in the cooling air. Sarah broke the silence, her voice low and strained. "Jedediah, it ain't just the land he wants." Caleb looked up, his gaze questioning. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My pa, he owed Jedediah money. A lot of money. Gambling debts." Mostly. Caleb waited, sensing there was more. "Pa died before he could pay it back. Jedediah says the debt now belongs to me." Her voice cracked. "He wants me to marry his son, Billy. Says it's the only way to settle things." The fire hissed as Caleb tossed another twig onto the flames. He understood now. It wasn't just about the land. It was about control, about power. Jedediah saw Sarai as a possession, a means to an end. "And you ran," Caleb stated, not a question. Sarai nodded, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "I wouldn't. I'd rather die than be chained to that animal." Caleb looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. She was stronger than she knew, fighting against a force that seemed insurmountable. He knew a little about being trapped. He sighed, the sound heavy in the night air. "I understand running. Been there myself." He paused, then surprised himself by confessing, "I wasn't always this. I was in the army." Once Sarah looked at him, surprised. He didn't strike her as a soldier. "Fort Laramie," Caleb continued, his voice flat. "5th Cavalry. Thought I was doing the right thing, protecting settlers from hostiles." He spat the word out like a bitter taste. "What happened?" Sarah asked softly. Caleb looked away, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Orders came down, Dice, to clear out a Cheyenne village. Women, children, didn't matter. Said they were harboring renegades." He paused, his jaw tight. I refused. Couldn't do it. They court-martialed me. They threw me out." The words hung in the air, heavy with shame and regret. It explained the haunted look in his eyes, the quiet sadness that seemed to cling to him like he'd carried this burden for years, the weight of his conscience a constant companion. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice filled with longing empathy. Caleb shrugged. "It is what it is. Just another reason to stay away from folks. From trouble." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound understanding. "Looks like trouble found me anyway." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his mother's wooden bird. He held it out to Sarah, a silent offering of comfort. "My mother used to say, even in the darkest night, there's always a star to guide you." He watched her carefully, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. Maybe we can be each other's star." Just for a little while, Sarah took the bird, her fingers gazing the smooth carvings. She looked at Caleb, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. The West was a harsh and unforgiving place, but in the heart of the darkness, a spark of hope had ignited. And maybe, just maybe, that spark could light their way to a better future. Sarah clutched the wooden bird, its smooth surface a small comfort against the growing dread in her gut. The shared story, the quiet confession around the campfire, had forged a fragile bond with Caleb. But the vast, unforgiving landscape held no room for sentimentality. It only recognized strength and survival. They rode in silence the next morning, the sun a burning eye in the sky. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, Sarah gasped. A plume of smoke stained the horizon, black against the pale blue. Caleb cursed under his breath, kicking his horse into a gallop. Sarah followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. As they drew closer, the scene came into sharper focus. The ranch house was a smoldering ruin, the windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinge. The barn was ablaze, flames licking at the dry wood, sending sparks spiraling into the air. They dismounted, the heat radiating from the burning structures searing their skin. Caleb strode towards the house, his face a mask of fury. Sarah followed, her shotgun held tight, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. The inside of the house was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied, clothes scattered across the floor. The air reeked of smoke and kerosene stain. It was a deliberate act, a message delivered in flames and destruction. Caleb stood in the middle of the wreckage, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. Years of quiet stoicism seemed to crumble away, replaced by a raw, primal rage. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was personal. Jedediah had crossed a line. Sarah touched his arm, her voice soft. "Caleb, we need to get out of here. They could still be around." He shook his head, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "No, I'm done running. I'm done hiding. This is my life, and I'm not letting him take it." He picked up a charred piece of wood from the floor, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. "He wants a war? He's got one." He turned to Sarah, his face grim. "We'll rebuild. We'll fight. We'll make him regret the day he ever set foot on this land." Sarah looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and admiration. She saw a different man standing before her, a man forged in the fires of adversity, a man willing to stand and fight for what was his. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of burning wood and the distant sound of crows. The sun beat down on them, relentless and unforgiving. The dust settled on the horizon, a silent promise of the coming storm. The acrid smell of burning timber hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of their loss. Caleb, his face streaked with soot, scanned the horizon. "They'll be back," he rasped, his voice rough from the smoke. "They want to make sure we're gone for good." Sarah reloaded her shotgun, her movements practiced and precise. "Let them come," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We'll be ready." They didn't have to wait long. As they salvaged what they could from the ruins, a few tools, some blankets, and a handful of canned goods, a volley of gunfire erupted from the surrounding hills. Bullets whizzed past them, kicking up dust and splintering what remained of the ranch house. "Ambush!" Caleb yelled, shoving Sarah behind a toppled wagon. He grabbed his rifle. His movements, surprisingly swift and fluid, despite his years away from a battlefield. Years hadn't dulled the instinct. He returned fire, aiming carefully at the puffs of smoke rising from the hillside. The attackers were well concealed, but Caleb had a knack for reading the land, for anticipating their movements. He'd learned it the hard way, on windswept plains and in dusty canyons. Sarah, crouched low behind the wagon, worked the lever of her shotgun with a practiced hand. She peered around the wagon wheel, her eyes narrowed, searching for a target. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, leveling a rifle. Sarah didn't hesitate, so she fired, the shotgun bucking in her hands. The figure staggered, dropped his rifle, and disappeared back behind the rocks. Caleb glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to be so capable. He'd seen fear in her eyes, yes, but also a steely resolve, a determination that mirrored his own. The gunfire intensified, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the whine of ricocheting bullets. Caleb moved with a grim efficiency, firing, reloading, and repositioning himself to keep the attackers pinned down. He was rusty, no doubt, but the fire of battle had rekindled something within him, a primal instinct to protect, to survive. Sarah, emboldened by her initial success, began to fire more frequently, her shotgun blasts echoing through the hills. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending her home, her future, her right to exist in this harsh and unforgiving land. She had never held a gun before she met Caleb, but her aim was steady, her movements quick. Jedediah had underestimated her. A bullet grazed Caleb's arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing a bead of blood. He grunted, ignoring the pain. "Stay low," he shouted to Sarah. "They're trying to flank us." He knew they couldn't hold out forever. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But he also knew that he wouldn't surrender. Not to Jedediah, not to anyone. He'd rather die fighting than live on his knees. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The gunfire slowly subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Caleb and Sarah remained hidden behind the wagon, their weapons at the ready, their senses on high alert. He looked at Sarah, her face smudged with dirt and sweat, her eyes shining with a defiant fire. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that they were in this together. And that, in the vast and lonely West, was all that mattered. The silence stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Caleb, his arm throbbing, risked a glance over the wagon wheel. The hills remained still, cloaked in the deepening shadows of twilight. He couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. "They're waiting," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Waiting for dark." Sarah, her face pale but resolute, crawled over to him. "Let me see your arm." He tried to wave her off. "It's just a scratch." But she was already kneeling beside him, her fingers guiltily probing the wound. He winced. "That's no scratch," she retorted, tearing a strip of cloth from her petticoat. "It's bleeding pretty good." She cleaned the wound with water from their dwindling supply, her touch surprisingly gentle. Caleb watched her, his gaze softening. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that belied her delicate appearance. As she worked, her fingers brushed against something hidden beneath her shirt. A glint of wood caught his eye. He frowned, his heart skipping a beat. "What's that?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah hesitated, her cheeks flushing. She reached inside her shirt and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, hanging from a leather cord. It was identical to the one he'd given her, the one his mother had cherished. The carving was unmistakable, the delicate curve of the wings, the tiny inquisitive eye. He stared at it, speechless. The blood drained from his face. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Where did you get that?" he finally managed to stammer, his voice thick with disbelief. Sarah looked confused. "My ma gave it to me. Said it was her lucky charm. She died when I was little, on the orphan train." All I had left of her, Caleb's mind reeled. The orphan train. His mother had spoken of sending his little sister away. On the orphan train, after his pot ate. She couldn't care for both of them. He'd been too young to understand, too wrapped up in his own grief. He'd never known what happened to her. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and gently touched the wooden bird. The wood was warm, familiar. A wave of emotion washed over him, grief, regret, and a glimmer of hope. "What is it, Caleb?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He looked at her, his eyes filled with tears he couldn't hold back. "That bird. My mother made that bird. She made two of them. One for me and one for my little sister. I thought she was lost forever." He paused, his voice cracking. "Cora, what was your mother's name?" Sarah's brow furrowed. Eliza Maeve." Caleb stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. Eliza Maeve. That was his mother's name. That was his sister's name. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm, his eyes locked on hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I think we're family." The revelation hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the burned ranch. Caleb's grip tightened on Sarah's hand. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly masked by a cautious hope. He knew he needed to tread carefully. This was a lot to take in, especially after the day they'd had. "Sarah," he began, his voice softer now. "Tell me everything you remember about your ma." She hesitated, glancing at the darkening hills, then back at Caleb. The firelight danced in her eyes, reflecting a lifetime of unanswered questions. "Not much," she admitted. "I was just a babe when I was orphaned, found by a wagon train headed west. They said she was sick, weak. Gave me the bird and a locket. Said to remember her." She reached inside her shirt again, this time producing a tarnished silver locket, hanging from a thin chain. It was dented and worn, but still bore the faint etching of a wildflower. Caleb recognized it instantly. He'd seen his mother wear it every day. He took the locket, his fingers tracing the delicate lines. "What did they say her name was again?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Eliza Maeve," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said she whispered it to them just before she passed." Caleb closed his eyes, a wave of grief and disbelief washing over him. Eliza Maeve, his mother, Sarah's mother. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture he never could have imagined. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Sarah's. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eliza Maeve was my mother too." Sarah's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in disbelief. Your mother?" Caleb nodded, the truth resonating within him with undeniable force. "My pa, he left us, years ago. Went prospecting and never came back. Ma was left with nothing. She sent my little sister away on the orphan train. Said she couldn't care for both of us. I never knew what happened to her." He paused, swallowing hard. "You're that little sister, Sarah. You're my family." He explained about his pie, the gambling, the broken promises, the sudden disappearance. He spoke of his mother's quiet strength, her unwavering love, her skill with a carving knife. He told her about the wooden birds, how she made them as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the smallest creature could find its way home. Sarah listened intently, her eyes searching his, trying to find any hint of deception. But she saw only truth, only raw emotion. The locket, the bird, the name, it all added up. "But how?" she asked, her voice trembling. How could she have another child? After the train? Caleb took a deep breath. This was the hardest part. My pa, he came back, Sarah. Just for a little while. Long enough to leave her with another child. A child he would never know. He paused, his gaze hardening. You were born after he left us for good. You're my half-sister. The realization dawned on Sarah, a mix of shock, anger, and a strange sense of relief. She understood now why she'd always felt like a piece of her was missing. Why she'd always yearned for a connection she couldn't explain. She had a family, and that family was standing right in front of her. His face of face etched with the same pain and longing she'd carried for so long. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire. The distant howl of a coyote echoed through the hills, a lonely sound that seemed to amplify the enormity of their discovery. The ataxia of the burning wrench, Jedediah. It all faded into the background, overshadowed by the profound and unexpected connection that had blossomed in the midst of chaos. They were family, and somehow, in the vast and unforgiving West, that meant everything. The coyote's howl died away, leaving an unsettling quiet. Sarah searched Caleb's face, a whirlwind of emotions battling within her. Family. After a lifetime of being alone, of drifting from place to place, the word felt foreign, almost dangerous. Yet looking into Caleb's weathered face, she saw a reflection of her own yearning, a shared history etched in the lines around his eyes. Before either could speak, a voice cut through the darkness, laced with a cruel amusement. Well, what have we here? A family reunion. Jedediah emerged from the shadows, flanked by two hulking figures, rifles glinting in the firelight. He surveyed the scene with a predatory grin, his eyes lingering on Sarah. Jedediah, Caleb growled, his hand instinctively tightening around his rifle. What do you want? Jedediah chuckled, a dry rasping sound. Now, Caleb, is that any way to greet an old acquaintance? I just came to collect what's rightfully mine. And maybe offer a little proposition. He gestured towards Sarah. I see you've acquired yourself a companion, a pretty little thing. But this land, he swept his hand across the charred remains of the ranch. This land is worth more than any woman. I'm willing to be generous. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. I'll let her go, unharmed, in exchange for the deed to this property, all of it. Caleb's face hardened. He knew Jedediah was a snake, but this was a new level of depravity. He glanced at Sarah, her eyes wide with fear, and a surge of protectiveness coursed through him. He couldn't let Jedediah touch her, not now, not ever. You think I'd sell my land for her? Caleb spat, trying to buy time. He needed a plan, a way out of this impossible situation. Jedediah shrugged. Everyone has a price, Caleb. And I suspect deep down you know this land is more trouble than it's worth. Just sign the deed, and she walks away, free and clear. Refuse and, well, let's just say things will get messy. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She understood. Jedediah was offering her life in exchange for Caleb's land. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was serious. Caleb looked from Sarah to Jedediah, his mind racing. He couldn't risk Sarah. But giving up the ranch, it was giving up everything he'd worked for, everything his father had promised him. He saw the desperation in Sarah's eyes, the silent plea for him to choose her. And in that moment, he made a decision, a dangerous decision, a decision that would change everything. "All right, Jedediah," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly calm. "You win. I'll sign the deed." Sarah stared at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and betrayal. "Caleb, no!" she cried. But he ignored her, his gaze fixed on Jedediah. "Buddy," Caleb continued, holding up a hand, "I have one condition. I sign the deed in the morning, at dawn, in front of witnesses, and you leave her alone until then. No tricks." Jedediah smiled. Slow, predatory smile. "Agreed, dawn it is. Don't try anything foolish, Caleb. My man will be watching." He nodded to his men, and they melted back into the shadows, leaving Caleb and Sarai, unforgiving, in the flickering firelight. As Jedediah disappeared, Sarah turned on Caleb, her eyes blazing. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "You'd sell me out for a piece of dirt." Caleb reached for her, but she recoiled, her face contorted with pain. "Sarah, you don't understand," he pleaded. "I have a plan." He knew he had betrayed her trust, but he had no other choice. He had to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear. He just hoped when the sun rose she would understand. He had a plan, a dangerous one that hinged on Jedediah's greed and his own desperation. He was going to give Jedediah exactly what he wanted, and then he was going to take it all back. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Caleb felt the weight of Sarah's distrust like a physical blow. He reached for her again, his calloused hand hovering hesitantly in the space between them. "Sarah, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. "I ain't selling you out. I'd never do that." He tried to explain, to lay bare the precarious plan forming in his mind, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the intricate web of deception he was weaving, the desperate gamble he was about to take, without sounding like a fool? How could he convince her that sacrificing the ranch was the only way to truly thief her, when his actions screamed the opposite? "Then what is it, Caleb?" she demanded, her voice tight with unshed tears. "What's your plan? You're just gonna hand over the land to that monster? After everything we've been through?" He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Jedediah likely had ears everywhere. Revealing his strategy would be a death sentence for both of them. "Just trust me, Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, just trust me." Until dawn, his plea fell on deaf ears. Sarah turned away, her back rigid with anger and disappointment. She moved to the far side of the wagon, as far away from him as she could get, and wrapped herself in a tattered blanket. The silence between them was heavier than any words could ever be. Caleb sat by the dying embers of the fire, his mind racing. He knew he'd hurt her, maybe irreparably. He saw the flicker of hope that had ignited in her eyes when he'd revealed their connection, now extinguished by his perceived betrayal. He had to fix this. He had to make her understand. He rose and began to quietly gather wood, feeding the flames until they danced with renewed vigor. He needed to stay alert, to be ready for anything Jedediah might throw at them. He also needed to come up with a way to explain his actions to Sarah, to regain her trust before the sun would see. Unbeknownst to Caleb, Sarah wasn't asleep. She lay awake, listening to the rustle of the wind in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft crackle of the fire. She was also listening to Caleb, to the subtle sounds of his movements, the quiet intensity of his breathing. She didn't trust him, not entirely. His willingness to give up the ranch so easily felt wrong, like a betrayal of everything he stood for. She'd heard whispers of his father, a man who chased fool's gold and gambled away everything he had. Was Caleb following in his footsteps, valuing land and possessions over human life? Driven by a need to know, to understand, Sarah crept from the wagon and moved silently towards the edge of the clearing. She saw Caleb pacing, his face etched with worry. He muttered to himself, his words lost in the night wind. She moved closer, cautiously until she could hear him clearly. Gotta be done. No other way. Lure him in. Take 'em both down. Sarah's blood ran cold. He wasn't planning on giving Jedediah the land. He was planning a trap for Jedediah and his son. She understood now. He was going to use the signing of the deed as a pretense to get Jedediah and his men close, to overpower them and take back what was rightfully his. It was a reckless plan, a suicide mission, and he was willing to risk everything, including his life, for a piece of dirt. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't chosen her. He had chosen the ranch, the land, the legacy. She was just a pawn in his game, a means to an end. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She turned and fled back to the wagon, her heart pounding in her chest. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. She was alone, truly alone. And as dawn approached, she knew she had to make a choice of her own. She couldn't stay here, waiting to be caught in Caleb's deadly game. She had to leave. She had to run. Before it was too late, dawn arrived, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. Arif was gone. Caleb woke with a jolt, the empty space beside him in the wagon a chilling testament to his failure. He scanned the horizon, his heart pounding in his chest. Tracks led west, away from the ranch, away from him. He cursed under his breath, the weight of his mistakes crushing him. He'd pushed her too far. He'd prioritized his pride, his plan, over her feelings. Now she was gone, walking into the unknown, and he had no one to blame but himself. He had a choice to make. Chase after her, beg for forgiveness, abandon his plan and the land that had been his father's undoing, or stick to his guns, face Jedediah, and hope that somehow he could still salvage everything. He knew deep down what he had to do. He couldn't let Jedediah win. He couldn't let Sarah's sacrifice, even if she hadn't seen it that way, be in vain. He had to protect what was left of his family's legacy, even if it meant losing her forever. He saddled his horse, his movements deliberate, his fusty mask of grim determination. He checked his rifle, his revolver, the knife strapped to his thigh. He was ready. As he rode towards the agreed-upon meeting point, the charred remains of his ranch looming in the distance. He saw them, Jedediah and his men waiting, their faces etched with anticipation. The deed was laid out on a makeshift table, a silent promise of what was to come. Jedediah grinned as Caleb approached, dismounting slowly, deliberately. "Right on time, Caleb. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." Caleb said nothing, his eyes scanning the surroundings, assessing the threat. He counted 4 men besides Jedediah, all heavily armed, all watching him with predatory eyes. The odds were stacked against him, but he was prepared to fight. "Where's the girl?" Jedediah asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Gone," Caleb replied, his voice flat. "She didn't want any part of this." Jedediah chuckled. "Smart girl. Now sign the deed, and let's be done with this." Caleb walked to the table, his hand hovering over the document. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and signed his name with a flourish. The land was no longer his. As he handed the deed to Jedediah, he saw her. A flicker of movement in the distance, a figure emerging from the shadows. Sarah. She was riding hard, a rifle in her hands, her face a mask of fury. "No," Jedediah roared, realizing too late that he'd been played. "Get her!" The air exploded with gunfire. Caleb dropped to the ground, drawing his revolver and firing back. Sarah, riding at full speed, unleashed a hail of bullets, taking down one of Jedediah's men. The showdown had begun. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows, turning the battlefield into a surreal landscape of death and vengeance. The gunfight was a whirlwind of dust and echoes. Caleb, low to the ground, moved with a speed born of desperation. He took down one man, with a shot to the chest, another with a well-aimed bullet to the leg. Jedediah screamed orders, his face contorted with rage. Sarah, a whirlwind of fury on horseback, kept the remaining men pinned down, her rifle spitting lead. But they were outnumbered. Caleb knew it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. He saw Jedediah's son, a sneering young man named Billy, circling around, trying to get a clear shot at Sarah. He made a decision. He had to draw their fire. He stood up, exposed, and fired a shot at Jedediah, narrowly missing his head. The remaining men turned their attention to him, unleashing a barrage of bullets. He ducked and weaved, dodging the deadly projectiles, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah seized the opportunity. She spurred her horse forward, charging directly at Billy. He panicked, firing wildly, but she was too fast. She knocked him off his horse with the butt of her rifle, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Caleb saw his chance. He lunged forward, tackling Jedediah to the toothy ground. They wrestled in the dirt, a brutal struggle for survival. Caleb, fueled by adrenaline and rage, managed to overpower Jedediah, pinning him beneath his weight. He raised his revolver, his hand shaking. He looked into Jedediah's eyes, saw the fear, the desperation. He hesitated. He wasn't a killer, but Jedediah was. Jedediah spat in his face. "You ain't got the guts," he hissed. That was all Caleb needed. He pulled the trigger. Silence descended, broken only by the whinnying of horses and the rustle of the wind. The dust settled, revealing the carnage. Jedediah and 2 of his men lay dead. Billy, bruised and shaken, had vanished. Caleb stood up, his body aching, his clothes covered in dirt and blood. He looked at Sarah, who was dismounting, her face pale. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. She didn't reply. She walked towards him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and anger. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the dead bodies. "You could have died," she said, her voice trembling. "For what? This wasteland?" "I was protecting you," Caleb said, his voice pleading. "I had to stop them." "Protecting me?" she scoffed. "Or protecting your land? You were willing to sacrifice everything for this dirt." "That's not true," Caleb protested. "I was trying to keep you Ivy. I knew Jedediah wouldn't let you go, not really. I had to lure him in, get him close. It was the only way." "The only way," she repeated, her voice rising. "There's always another way, Caleb. You just didn't want to find it. You chose this violence. You chose this land." She turned and walked away, towards her horse. "Where are you going?" Caleb asked, his voice filled with despair. "Away from here," she replied without looking back. "Away from you." He watched her ride off, disappearing into the vast expanse of the west. He knew he'd lost her. He'd won the battle, saved the ranch, but lost the only thing that truly mattered. The dust swirled around him, a lonely testament to his victory. He stood alone, the owner of a charred ranch, a silent graveyard, and a broken heart. The coyote howled again, a mournful cry that echoed his own despair. The sun beat down on Caleb's back, each ray a hammer blow of regret. He watched Sarah's retreating figure until she was nothing more than a shimmering heat mirage on the horizon. The victory tasted like ash. He'd kept the land, but the cost was unbearable. He spent the next few days burying the dead, a grim task that mirrored the burial of his own hopes. He patched up the bullet-riddled ranch house, the silence within its walls a constant, gnawing reminder of Sarah's absence. He barely ate, barely slept, haunted by her accusing eyes. One morning he found her, not writing back, but in the weathered box he kept under the porch. A deed transferring ownership of the ranch to him. She'd signed it before riding off, a final silent act he couldn't decipher. Was it forgiveness? A curse? He didn't know. He spent the rest of the day wrestling with it. The land. It had been the source of so much pain, so much conflict. His father's obsession, his own near downfall, and now, the wedge driven between him and Sarah. He finally understood. The land wasn't worth it. Not without her. He rode to the nearest town, a dusty collection of saloons and storefronts, clinging to the edge of the desert. He found a lawyer, a man with squinting eyes and ink-stained fingers, and instructed him to draw up another deed. A week later, he rode west following Sarah's tracks. He found her camped by a creek, her horse grazing peacefully. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He held out the deed. "I signed it over," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "The ranch. It's yours." She stared at the document, then at him, her eyes searching his. "Why?" He swallowed hard. Because it ain't worth nothing without you, Sarah. I was a fool. Blinded by pride, by a need to hold on to something that nearly destroyed me. It was my father's poison, and I almost let it kill us both. He paused, gathering his courage. I realize now, your family, Ihare. More than any piece of dirt could ever be for Haiti. You said I didn't choose you. You were right. I was wrong. He lowered his gaze ashamed. This ain't a gift. It's me trying to make things right. To show you I understand. You deserve a place to call home. A place where you can be safe. He looked up again, meeting her eyes. I ain't asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I am asking, can we start over? Not as something else, but as what we truly are. Brother and sister? Sarah was silent for a long moment, her gaze unforgiving. He could see the pain, the distrust still lingering in her eyes. But he also saw something else, a flicker of hope. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shrugged. Head north, maybe. See what's out there. I ain't meant for settling down. Not yet, anyway. Maybe someday I'll earn my peace. But for now, I need to find my own way. He offered her a small, sad smile. This is your home now, Sarah. Take care of it. Take care of yourself. He turned and walked back to his horse, leaving the deed in the dirt. He mounted and rode away, without looking back. He knew he was leaving a part of himself behind, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. He rode into the setting sun, the vast open range stretching before him. Redemption wasn't a place, it was a journey, and his had just begun. Blood was thicker than land, he thought, but trust once broken was the hardest thing to mend. He just hoped someday she'd truly believe he'd learned that lesson. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying his unspoken apology into the endless west.